Welcome back. Coming up in this section of the course, we'll take a close look at how to control your elements in your layout using common CSS display modes like block, inline, and inline block. Understanding the differences between block, inline, and inline block display settings will help take your CSS layouts to the next level, and it will help save a lot of time and maybe a little frustration when using common properties like width, height, padding, and margins. In the CSS Basics course, you learned that every element on a web page is a rectangular box that's displayed as either a block level element or an inline element. Block level elements like divs, paragraphs, and headings stack on top of each other like a stack of blocks instead of appearing side by side on the same line. A browser normally displays a block level element as a single block of content with a break before and after it. Inline elements like images, links, and span tags do not create line breaks in a layout. They appear on the same line as the content and elements beside them. A feature of CSS is the ability to change the default behavior of elements. In this video, I'll show you how changing element display values from block to inline affects surrounding elements and the space they take up on the page. For instance, you can make list items, which normally appear stacked on top of each other, appear side by side to form a navigation bar. First, I'll start with a simple layout example. I'm going to show you how to position elements side by side, starting with inline display, to create this horizontal navigation. To follow along using the latest workspace, launch the workspace on this page. So when I preview my latest workspace, you can see that currently the elements in the header are formatted visually as blocks by default, because the H1, unordered list, and list items are all block level elements. They naturally expand to fill their parent container div in the header. So they each take up an entire line in the layout, and no other elements can be positioned on their left or right sides. That's why they appear stacked. But we can manipulate this layout by changing their display modes. In the CSS, I applied a white background color to the name and main nav list items, so you can see exactly how the different display modes affect their layout. So I'll want to keep the site name and navigation on a single column in small screens and mobile devices. As you learned earlier, it's usually best to display mobile layouts as one column layouts because of the narrow screen width on a mobile device. So I'm going to change the layout of the site name and navigation in large screens only. And one of the easiest ways I can create a horizontal navigation is by changing the display properties of these elements from block to inline. In the Style Sheets meta query, I'll create a new rule that targets the name element and list items inside main nav. In the rule, I'll add a display property and set the value to inline. When we save and preview it in the browser, you can see that the site name no longer takes up an entire line on the page. It's now as wide as its content. And the navigation items also display side by side on the same line. But the navigation still displays below the site name. To place the navigation on the same line as the name element, I also need to set the display mode of the main nav unordered list to inline. If I inspect the main nav element with the dev tools, you can see that even though the list items display is set to inline, the main nav UL is a block level element, so it's still taking up an entire line in the layout. That's why it's dropping below the name element. Back in my style sheet, if I target the class main nav to set its display to inline, when I refresh the page, the name and navigation items appear on the same line. Great. It's important to know that when it comes to margins and padding, browsers treat inline elements differently. When an element's display is set to inline, like the items here in the header, the browser will not apply any width and height properties or top and bottom margin settings. An inline element will only accept left and right margins and any padding value. So for example, back in the media query, I'll create a new rule that targets the class name. Then I'll give it a width of 240 pixels and a top and bottom margin of 50 pixels. So back in the browser, even though I've applied a width and a top and bottom margin to the name element, when I refresh the page, you can see that nothing in the layout changes. And the same will happen if I give the navigation list items a width or top and bottom margins, because they're also displayed inline. But if I give the name element a right margin value, so I'll say margin right 50 pixels, when I take a look at it again, notice how it pushes the main navigation away 50 pixels. So inline elements naturally flow next to each other, just like text in a paragraph. So any margin and padding values will only push surrounding elements away horizontally, like you're seeing here. They never push them away vertically. So for example, I want to expand the clickable areas in my header links using padding. In the base layout styles outside the media query, I'm going to create a new rule that targets the links inside the name and main nav elements. Links are inline elements by default. So if I try to use padding to expand them with a top and bottom padding value of 10 and a left and right padding value of 15 pixels, when we refresh the browser, notice how the padding doesn't make the links any taller, just 15 pixels wider on the left and right sides. Inline elements only take on the left and right padding values applied, not the top and bottom values. Also, when I resize the viewport, notice how the navigation items begin to wrap to the next line below the name as its container space gets narrower. This is the natural behavior of inline elements, and it's what I meant earlier when I said inline elements naturally flow next to each other, just like text in a paragraph. You'll learn how to adjust both the padding in the links and the wrapping of the nav items in the next lesson using the inline block display value.